This topic is bitumen beyond combustion. Bryan Helfenbaum from Alberta Innovates, who leads the work at Alberta Innovates on bitumen beyond combustion and is also a fellow of the Energy Futures Lab.
Just like to say good morning and hello to everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I'm one of actually 5 people at Alberta Innovates who get to work on this file. I'm actually the only one of those 5 without a PhD, but I'm the one who's the fellow with the EFL, so this is what you get. At least one of my colleagues is online, so maybe I'll handle the softball questions and I'll get ready to pitch over to him if necessary. So I'm the Executive Director of Advanced Hydrocarbons, and BBC is within my portfolio, becoming a more and more important part of that going forward. So if you can click to the next slide, please, Chad. I'm going to speak a bit about to provide some context for where this came from and why we're excited about it. So we'll start with the problem statement or opportunity statement. Alberta is holds the 3rd largest reserve of petroleum in the world. Most of that in our oil sands area. Now, we produce 3 million barrels a day, but 90% of that product that we create ultimately ends up as a fuel, diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, etc. And when we talk about greenhouse gases on a life cycle basis, 80% of the GHGs that are associated with bitumen actually happen at combustion of that fuel. So while we, rightfully put a lot of scrutiny on the extraction of our bitumen, and industry's done a good job reducing our GHG intensity by about 20% over the last decade, but that's really the tip of the iceberg because most of the GHGs actually happen at combustion. And so another important part of this dialogue relates to, we often talk about our oil sands as having high carbon intensity. And there's 2 very different facets to that statement. One relates to the extraction, right? And so the methodologies that we use to get our oil sands out of the ground and to market consume a lot of energy. So SAGD, steam assisted gravity drainage, which represents a growing proportion of the production. We have to make steam, which means burning a lot of natural gas, which creates emissions. Now, some of the top tier assets actually have carbon intensity similar to the average US barrel, but on the whole, we're still a bit above the rest of the world when it comes to carbon intensity. But there's another facet of this carbon intensity which is more important, and this is at the molecular level, right? And so about 20% of the oil sands that we produce are in what we call asphaltenes, which is the heavier end, and have a higher carbon to hydrogen ratio. And this is the component that really gives us this characteristically sticky, high viscosity bitumen. So we actually have more carbon atoms at play as well as the higher carbon intensity on the extraction side. Click, please. So the other thing we need to talk about is where this planet is going, right? Despite a global pandemic right now, we're going to hit 9 billion people by the middle of this century. And maybe more importantly, we are seeing growing prosperity, which is excellent as societies that are grappling with poverty start to emerge and approach middle-class way of life. And with that comes a rising demand for materials. And this is for housing, infrastructure, transportation, consumer goods. And so what is a lot of that stuff made out of but carbon? So what we're trying to do is flip this on its head. Click, please. Can we take this high carbon intensity, which is a vulnerability and a weakness when we talk about selling fuels as our product, and instead think of it as a strategic advantage, right? If carbon is increasingly the building block of materials, then can we pivot, and start to move away from fuels as our primary revenue and more towards materials? And so, click please. The concept here is, quite simple. Can we develop scalable, high-value, non-fuel products from bitumen? And all 3 of those are important. They have to scale, there has to be high value, and they have to be non-fuel to avoid those GHGs. And this is one of those great opportunities, say it starts with a thought experiment, that really gets to check a lot of those boxes. We could create whole new industries here. So dramatic job creation, economic diversification that we've been talking about, but not really executing on in major ways for a very long time. Significant greenhouse gas reduction, and then protecting the value of that resource that we have, right? That resource is massive, but the market for the oil that we produce, is diminishing. And we can argue about how quickly it's diminishing, but the reality is that it does have an expiry date of some kind. And so we need to think about how we can diversify the markets for that. Click, please. So in 2017, Alberta Innovates sponsored a study. This was authored by Dr. Axel Meisen to look at all of the different things you could make out of bitumen, right? And there's actually a pretty good list here. And we'll put aside for, initially, what is actually a good idea or an economic idea, but these are just conceptually, what are the possibilities. A second white paper was commissioned, this one authored by Stantec. And this started to zero in on, okay, let's look at the markets, the current supply chain, the chemistry fundamentals, what's really viable from this list. And then on top of that, launch some early stage R&D projects. Click, please. And 4 of these opportunities really started to emerge as the most promising. And these are at different stages. Asphalts for a global market and activated carbon are more near term, potentially, in terms of commercialization. But for the balance of this discussion today, I'm going to focus on carbon fibers. And so I do that knowing that the rest of these are still quite exciting and viable, but carbon fibers represents overall the biggest opportunity that we see at this time. Click, please. And so, to the uninitiated, carbon fibers are their own class of materials. They have outstanding strength, durability, and anti-corrosiveness. They can be up to 10 times stronger than steel, or put another way, you can replace a steel part and have it weigh about 1/10 as much. And so that's obviously quite exciting for potentially steel replacement, as well as additives to concrete, wood, plastic products. And indeed, industries like that are hungry for carbon fibers, but they haven't been able to work because of economics for the most part. And we'll talk about that in a moment. You might think of carbon fibers in your daily life as being a pretty specialty product. It might be in your bike or your hockey stick, a tennis racket. If you're lucky, maybe a few parts in a high-end BMW. But its market is growing rather quickly. The current global demand is 100,000 tons per year, with double-digit growth year over year. So pretty exciting even at its current price point. Click, please. So let's get into the numbers here, and this will really help explain why we're excited about this at Alberta Innovates. Carbon fiber comes in a variety of different grades. It's not a single ubiquitous substance. And it sells for $8 to $16 per pound, depending on its end use. We are targeting $5 a pound. So both those are in US dollars. And why, click, please, is there's been numerous studies done, I think most notably by the US Department of Energy, that basically shows all the end users that are hungry for cheap carbon fiber. If we can get carbon fiber down to $5 a pound, the market would grow by 10 times virtually overnight, right? And others would suggest 50 times or 100 times over time, as we'd start to deploy carbon fiber to replace steel in the automotive industry, which is the one most people think about. And it's a huge opportunity, of course, aerospace as well. But we're also talking about concrete, building materials. So you would start to see it in bridges, which because of the anti-corrosiveness, bridges wouldn't last 50 years anymore, they last 250. It would appear in buildings and infrastructure all over the place. So how do we get to $5 a pound? Well, if you look at the current breakdown of price for carbon fiber, click please. The feedstock, which comprises 90% of production of carbon fiber today, is polyacrylonitrile, or PAN. And it makes up about 1/3 of the price of carbon fiber. And so if we are able to replace that feedstock of PAN with something like asphaltene, we are just dramatically wiping out up to 1/3 of that price right away. And so of course the challenge is developing a cost competitive manufacturing process to work with that, but it gives us a lot of room to play. So in some ways we're competing with the current market, But what we're really trying to do is create entire new blue oceans of opportunity. So we're not really as much competing with PAN as we are trying to open up completely new markets. Click, please. That opportunity brought home to a Canadian basis is it would allow us to almost quintuple the value of a barrel of oil. Now, I appreciate it, as I think about it in today's context, some oil is at negative pricing, so that maybe doesn't sound quite as good as it did a few weeks ago. But certainly the opportunity to generate value from materials instead of fuels has a massive value multiple, and overall could contribute $50 to $100 billion a year in revenue to the economy. So just a massive opportunity. Now, let's add a bit of perspective. This is the Gartner hype cycle. Some of you have seen this before. It's used for emerging technologies and kind of that peak of inflated expectations. And if you click, you'll see BBC is definitely somewhere on this continuum. I don't know exactly where. But I just want to get in front of this to say, this is a really exciting opportunity. You're seeing some grandiose ideas and big ambitions, and we do think this is real. But there are some very challenging aspects that we still need to get through. You are not going to be able to go to Home Depot next year and buy some carbon fiber reinforced plywood to build your deck. This is going to take some time. We have some very real challenges. So we try to balance this at Alberta Innovates. We do need a bit of hype to attract funding, to attract some great minds to work on this. But we also need to caution the public that this is going to take some time to get there. Click, please. So the team has worked to really zero in on some of the key challenge areas going forward, and really there's lots of challenges for people to work on, whether it's in the scientific fundamentals, the chemistry of the situation, whether we need a mesophase to develop. The impact of sulfur and metals, as most people know, there are impurities within bitumen. How do we deal with them? Can we get them out? What impact do those have on your end product in terms of the grades of carbon fiber that you're able to produce, as well as the final disposition of that? Short carbon fibers have a really significant market, but right now we're basically making long fibers and chopping them. So is there a more effective approach to really tackle that market? Scale up is an issue. When we look at how carbon fiber is made today, it doesn't scale terribly well. So if we're really talking about a 10 times multiple happening very fast, we need to reinvent the way that we produce carbon fiber at scale. And then of course there's the economics, energy requirements, and associated GHGs, right? If we develop a process, but it is super energy intensive, then we may give back all of the gains that we're expecting to get by diverting bitumen from combustion. Click, please. So just to set up our conversation, where we're at, where we're going. I mentioned the 2 white papers that were produced in 2017 and 2018. With Alberta Innovates, we've partnered with mostly academic institutions. We've launched a few R&D projects already. We have a few more in the hopper that should be starting up here shortly. Some of you are aware that in parallel with this, a few months ago, we launched the first phase of a $15 million grand challenge. And the reason for this is really to, again, draw in some new minds and new ways of looking at this. Within the province of Alberta, within Canada, we have some deep expertise when it comes to bitumen chemistry. But we don't really have a ton of expertise when it comes to carbon fiber. And so while the University of Alberta is doing fantastic work in this space, this opportunity is too big to really have only one horse in the race. And so we're reaching out to the US, to Europe, to Asia, and indeed to Alberta and to Canada to participate in this grand challenge. Right now, looking for kind of proofs of concept, what are some novel approaches that we can take. In phase 2, we get into scaling, so move from a batch to a continuous process. We add some quality specifications that are required, but we're still at the grams per day level at that stage, and then we scale up to a demonstration phase into the kilograms a day by 2023, meeting those commercial specs. And we think that we'll be in a position by the middle of the decade to sanction commercial projects in this space. Now, who is sanctioning them? Where are they happening? That is an open question that I think we'll talk about. But this is where we think this is going in the next few years. We will hopefully debate whether this is too aggressive or not aggressive enough, but right now this is how we are positioned. So to summarize and be able to open the dialogue, last click please, Chad. Some key takeaways. Number one, we need to think differently, right? And we need to think about the resource that we have, what it is and what we can do with it. There's this concept of the low carbon future. And it's a bit of a misnomer because it's really important that we keep carbon out of the atmosphere. But carbon is going to play a very significant role when it comes to materials. And that's good. That's sequestered carbon. There's a lot of talk of graphene, nanotubes, carbon fiber. All of these are made of carbon. Carbon is going to be a big part of our future. We just need to keep it sequestered in stuff and combust it a lot less. We can make up to 5 times a value on our barrel by making these products. We could generate 50 to 100 billion a year is just for carbon fiber. So when you layer on those other BBC opportunities, it could be even more. These are very rough estimates. One thing I didn't get into is that this opportunity is very synergistic with partial upgrading, which is to say when you take that 20% of the heavy ends out of the barrel, what you're left with is a lighter oil. And that lighter oil has more value, can be sold as a fuel, and maybe more importantly, can be moved through pipelines without having to add significant diluent to it. So right now, diluent makes up about 1/3 of our pipeline capacity that's carrying bitumen. And so we can free up a lot of that capacity, which is of course a very compelling opportunity right now without having to lay new pipelines. So overall, there's a ton of opportunity to interact. This is, I'm here because this is a call to action. If you are a chemistry geek and want to dive into the fundamentals and work in a lab, fantastic. There's a grand challenge suitable for you right now. We need some engineering minds to work on scale up, design, integration. We need to talk about supply chain. Policy development is going to be really key. So there's lots of different ways to participate in this opportunity. So that's all I had. I'll turn it back to Chad now to facilitate. And here, if you have any questions, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is this a great idea? Is this a terrible idea? A waste of resources? Really looking for some feedback. So back to you, Chad.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brian. And for not having a PhD, you did a good job of sounding too smart. So way to go. I think for, this is probably a very diverse audience here. So thank you for laying this out in a way that I think we can all kind of understand the basics of what's involved and some of the opportunity areas. There's several questions in the Slido, so I'll just choose a few to get us started here. There's one question that says, besides cost, what other barriers would industries need to overcome to integrate carbon fiber into their supply chains?
Well, it's hard to say. There are some obvious synergies in terms of the partial upgrading of the crude, separating out the asphaltenes and processing it. Right now, so we have a strategic advisory committee, which is comprised of oil sands producers, carbon fiber manufacturers, and end users of carbon fiber products. And we are getting, great participation from the oil sands producers. They see this opportunity as interesting, but it's pretty early. And so most of them are not, making huge investments right now. They're at the table, they're engaged, they're providing guidance. But this needs to get a little bit further to really understand kind of how this can integrate. And ultimately, those companies will need to decide if they want to be in the business or how much of that value chain they want to capture. Right now, this is a brand new business line in some ways, and we get different feedback from different companies in terms of how they might participate in this. Policy is going to play a role as well, right? And in incentivizing whether this happens, here or somewhere else, and again, what portions of that value chain do we capture?
Okay, thanks, Brian. A couple more questions about carbon fiber, and then I'm going to choose a couple others. But can you talk about competitors' activity, carbon fiber manufacturing? And then I'll just pose another one here as well. You touched on it briefly, but could you expand on why Alberta would produce carbon fiber at a lower cost of supply than other areas with hydrocarbon reserves?
Sure. So, sorry, threw me off a bit with the second question. So the first question was about competitors in terms of carbon fiber manufacturing. I mean, so right now, carbon fiber is 90% comes from PAN. There are a number of large companies, SGL Carbon, Zoltech. Those are US-based companies. The closest geographically is in Washington State. That's SGL Carbon. It's a very carbon-intensive process, so they make use of the hydro resources that are there for low carbon electricity. A number of, so I'll say most notably Oak Ridge National Lab, as well as some others, have been looking at feedstock replacements for carbon fiber for quite some time. Recognizing that they can only get costs down so far with PAN. They've looked at things like lignin, like coal, other products, and basically had zero success over the last while. And there are some pretty significant facilities that have been stood up to try to test these, but there hasn't been any real testing of bitumen or asphaltenes. So we think this is a really interesting and compelling opportunity. We have worked with those same manufacturers. So we've worked with SGL, with Zoltech. We're at the table with them. In fact, they are on our strategic advisory committee because they see this opportunity as extremely compelling. But obviously some challenges to actually get there. In terms of why would it be cheap? Well, I explained the cost competition of cost competitiveness of asphaltene versus PAN. In terms of our oil versus other oils, because we have a heavy grade of oil, because there are opportunities with partial upgrading to remove the heavier ends, we are in an advantaged position relative to most other sources of oil. That doesn't mean we are completely unique. There are, of course, other heavy oils in the globe. We haven't really dug into the nuances, and the truth is we don't really know, right? We get a lot of questions right now about is Suncor's oil better than Cenovus's, or what are the different sources of oil sands and asphaltenes, and whose is going to be better, and we just don't know, right? These are early stages. We're actually in the process of standing up an asphaltene sample bank, and this will allow researchers to get their hands on, call it a bucket of asphaltenes or bitumen as they want to. So we need to investigate and solve some of those issues, and we'll start to zero in on what are the specific characteristics that make something advantaged, and it probably will be different advantages for bitumen that could go to carbon fiber versus some of the other BBC products that I listed on the early slides.
Okay, thanks, Bryan. So two quick questions that are a little bit more technical, I think, and then there's one that I'm going to pose that's really more about strategy. So, oops, I just moved on my thing. Okay, does this also support extracting hydrogen from bitumen? That's one question. And then the second is just, I guess, a clarification. Did I understand correctly that this wouldn't solve 100% of a barrel's combustible emissions, but around 20%? So can you just clarify those numbers? And then the second question is interesting, or the one I just posed about hydrogen, because that relates to another stream that's being discussed in this session as well.
Sure, absolutely. So with respect to hydrogen, no is the short answer. We are actively engaged with companies like Proton Technologies. It's an exciting space for in situ hydrogen generation, but this is a different opportunity space than that. So I do encourage you to investigate that. Obviously, it's in another room right now, but this is not directly related to hydrogen. And then sorry, remind me the second question.
Did I understand correctly that this wouldn't solve 100% of a barrel's combustible emissions, but around 20%?
That's right. So carbon fiber, the opportunity as we understand it today, is the desired pathway would involve extracting the asphaltene fraction, which is about, upwards of 20% of the barrel. And that would be the portion diverted towards carbon fiber manufacturing. The asphalt opportunity would actually be a much larger portion of the barrel. That could be 50, 60% of the barrel that would go towards asphalt, with the balance to fuels. Whereas, at the other bookend is vanadium. Vanadium makes up about 250 parts per million of the barrel. And so that obviously isn't really diverting a lot. So when you look at this opportunity, it kind of depends how you want to rank them in terms of opportunity. So from a purely economics perspective, we see carbon fiber as number one, but absolutely from a greenhouse gas reduction perspective, asphalt would be a bigger opportunity. But these don't necessarily need to compete. There's 3 million barrels a day of bitumen being produced. If the carbon fiber market will take a little bit of time to grow to meet the potential production that we could make. So all of these BBC products, including activated carbon, are in play and exciting.
Okay, thanks, Bryan. That's very helpful, I think. And this question I'm going to pose now, it relates to the overall theme of this session, the economic recovery. So Leo Rothschild asks, what is an immediate step that can be taken as we come out of this recovery that would move us in this direction and get to commercialization more quickly than, say, by 2050?
Great question, Leo. Nice to see you on the line. Something that's come up, in light of the current situation that we're in, has been about funding. And it's been great seeing some, cheerleaders I don't even know saying, hey, this is a great opportunity. The government needs to put, somebody put $500 billion into this opportunity. I got that email recently. And while, I'd never turned down $500 billion, the reality is capital isn't solving the problem right now, right? We're really at a stage where we need ideas. We need great minds working on this. And so capital will be an obstacle in the not too distant future. But right now we're really at the TRL 2, 3, 4 stage. We're in the lab. We're working with some great people. So we're trying to expand that network. So what we could really benefit from is connections, right, with these other researchers from around the world, right? There are people in Japan, South Korea, Germany, parts of the US. How do we get their attention? How do we get them excited about this opportunity? And then how do we start to think about the integration, the scale up, and really solving some of these issues? We also, in parallel, need to be working on policy design, right? It would be a terrible outcome if we de-risk this technology and figure out a way to really convert asphaltenes into carbon fiber at low cost, and find ourselves in a situation where we are still shipping dilbit to the US, and it's facilities in the US that are capturing all of that value chain. And so we end up with maybe a slight uptick in our dilbit valuation, but that's it, right? The other bookend of that is we capture all of the value chain, right? We separate it out here. We do some modifications to the asphaltene. We spin it into carbon fiber. We stand up an automotive industry and additional concrete that are using it. That's probably a bit unrealistic. But how much of that value chain can we reasonably capture, right? We do have end users like Lafarge in industries. We have wood manufacturing, wood products. So how do we really get the most out of that? How do we get policy being developed to incentivize companies, entrepreneurs, oil sands companies, whoever, to play a major role in this? Again, right now, it's probably not investable, but we need to find ways to accelerate this opportunity because, frankly, we need to badly.